Selection tools in Photoshop are pretty important. You must first be able to select something in order to affect it. So we're going to go over some of the basic selection tools in Photoshop. But as we do, remember there's usually more than one way to make the same selection. For this example, we'll be creating a really basic internet button. So to begin, let's create a new file. Go to File, choose New, and then set this one to be 5 inches wide by 5 inches tall at 72 dots per inch because this is a file for online, and RGB also because this is a file for online. And I would have my background content set to white and then click OK. Now I'm going to hit Command 0 so that this fits to fill my screen. And anytime we are creating something, especially something like a button, it's a good idea to make it on its own layer. And layers are great in Photoshop because we can manipulate them individual from each other. So in your layers palette, click the new layer button, and let's name this one base. Okay, so grab your rectangular marquee tool. It is below the Move tool in the toolbox. If you click and hold on it, you'll notice that there's a rectangular, elliptical, and a couple of others. Choose rectangular, the shortcut for which is M. And then click and begin dragging to create a selection. And you'll notice it's got these little black and white dashed lines. Those are called marching ants. And as you're creating this selection, you'll notice if I'm moving around I can shape it to anything. But if I wanted this button to be a perfect square, I hold down Shift, and that will immediately constrain it to be a perfect square. Then to finish your selection, let go of your mouse, and the quality of those marching ants changes a little bit. Now I have a square created, and anything I do with a paintbrush or a bucket will only affect the area inside of here. So I'm going to pick a color to begin with, and to match my example I'm going to go with kind of a mid-blue and click OK. Remember, to fill, you can either grab your paint bucket tool or hit Option Delete to fill any selection. Once you've filled your selection, you want to deselect, because until you deselect you won't be able to affect any of the area outside of it. So I'm going to hit Command D. You can also deselect by going to the Select menu and choosing the Deselect option. Let's create a new layer for the next bit of color. Clicking on my new layer button there. Grab your marquee tool again, and this time we're going to talk about some of the settings up here. So feather is the edge quality of your selection. The selection that we just created had a 0 feather, so now if I set this to, for example, about 8 pixels, and then I'm going to click and drag to create another square inside of my blue, and I'm holding down Shift so that it is also square. When you let go of this selection, you'll notice a couple things. The first being that the corners on this are curved. That means I do have some feather set. The higher that number is, probably the bigger the curves will be. So in this case, let's grab a slightly lighter color. You can even slightly shift the color to be a little bit different than your base and click OK. And then I'm going to use Option Delete to fill that area. And you can see that the edges are quite different than the edges on the outside of my square. I'm going to hit Command D to deselect. Let's name this layer Midtone. So this is the basic shape of our button, and I'm going to introduce to you the circular marquee or the elliptical marquee tool. If you'll grab that, and notice that it has the same options up here, and we have something called anti-aliasing that is turned on. So before we go much further, I want you to just pay attention for a minute while I show you what anti-aliasing is. I'm going to zoom in quite close to this area and hide my 2 layers that are existing and create a new layer for my example. And you don't need to follow along with this, I just want you to see what this is. In my elliptical marquee tool control bar, I have this option called anti-aliasing. If I set feather to 0 and create a selection just like I did with my square, and I can even hold down the shift if I want it to be perfectly circle, and then fill by hitting option delete, you can see if I back up it's got a little bit of a fuzzy edge, but remember my feather was set to 0. This actually isn't a feathered edge. What this is Photoshop's way of making an edge appear smooth to the human eye. So if I zoom out where this would be full size, I can see that it's got a very nice, smooth, crisp edge. Alright, zooming back in. I'm going to take my marquee tool, which I got by hitting M, and uncheck this anti-aliasing option and make a circle about the same size and then fill it with color and deselect. Now you should be able to see a really big difference between these two on their edge quality. This one's got a slight fuzzy on the edge and this one has absolutely no fuzzy at all. It's just solidly those same pixels. In most cases you want this anti-aliasing option turned on. Let's see, grab my correct tool here. The anti-aliasing option turned on, just because you will get some really kind of jaggedy, almost bitmappy looking images if you create with that anti-aliasing turned off. So that's what anti-aliasing is. Alright, I'm going to delete this layer, say yes, and turn on my other two and grab midtone, which was the layer I was working on, and hit Command 0 so I can zoom back out and see everything. Now that we have our elliptical tool, let's create a layer with a semicircle on it. So create a new layer, and if you click and begin dragging inside of the blue square and hold down Shift to keep it perfectly circular, you can click and drag to make your circle. But before you let go of your mouse, notice that if you hold down the space bar, again you can move that around before it's finalized if you for some reason weren't able to get it set in the right place in the first place. So here I'm holding both Shift and space bar to move that around. And then when I let go of my mouse button, I have a circular selection. Now these selection tools have a couple other options. Up here in the bar you can see I've got this first one is depressed, which is the setting that I'm currently using. It has some other things like add to selection and subtract from selection, as well as intersect. You can do this next bit I'm going to show you with these buttons, but I'm going to show you how to do it with shortcuts because they are so much easier than coming up here and grabbing these buttons. To take away from a selection to make, for example, a moon shape from a circle, I would hold down minus, and you'll notice that right by your cursor it got a little minus sign. Now if I click and drag to create a selection and overlap some of my original selection when I let go, I'm left with the moon shape. So everything that I overlapped is now gone. The adding to a selection you can do by holding Shift and then clicking and dragging. When you let go, now I've got two areas that are selected. Let's fill these areas with a color. I'm going to grab a complementary color to my blue in kind of this yellowy orangey range and click OK, and I'm going to hit Option Delete to fill and Command D to deselect. And because I had my anti-aliasing option turned on, these have nice smooth edges. Okay, let's call this one just shape, unless you want to call it something else. So that's some of the major functions of these selection tools. Let's finish off this button though. Let's create a highlight for it like these buttons often have as kind of a glow feature. Create a new layer and choose highlight. Now if you ever look at something, an object around you, the glossier the object is, the harder that highlight might be, so the edges might be really hard instead of soft. So on this one I want it to be only sort of glossy, and the less glossy something is, the softer those edges are, so I want soft edges. Anytime you think soft or fuzzy edges, you need to go to feathering. So I'm going to actually switch back to my rectangular marquee tool and set the feather to a little higher than what I had before, maybe to about 12. And hit OK or Enter. And then I'm just going to choose a small area up here in kind of the top right. And when I let go, you'll notice because my feathering was higher, I almost got completely curved edges right there. And if I grab a either white or a really bright light version of the color that I was working with before, that makes a good highlight. So I'm going to click OK and then Option Delete to fill. So there's a highlight. Now there's one more really cool little selection trick I'm going to show you with the way we've got our file set up. What if I wanted to take this base layer shape and make it go from bright to dark? Meaning I want to add a gradient in it. Right now, if I grab my gradient tool, which is underneath your bucket tool, so I'm going to click on bucket and hold down and choose gradient. Up here in the tool control bar, you can see the gradient that is chosen. If you click on that, you'll see the gradient editor window pop up. And it's got a couple of defaults. These first two are the foreground to background solid, and the second one is foreground to transparent. So I'm going to choose that second one, foreground to transparent, and click OK. And then I'm going to change my foreground color to the darker tone of this blue, or shade if I'm being perfectly correct, and click OK. But watch this, if I click and drag, my blue is actually going to fill in everywhere around that, and that's not what I want. So hit Command Z to undo. What I want to do is select this square so only the inside of that square gets filled, but I want to select it perfectly. If I just grabbed my marquee tool and set the feather to 0 and came up, I could eyeball it probably pretty close, but there's actually a pretty good chance that I'd miss some of those pixels. The way you can select perfectly an object that is on a layer is to hold down the Command button, and in your Layers panel, hover over the thumbnail. You'll notice you get a little marquee tool on top of your cursor, and that means that if you hold down Command and click on that layer, it will automatically make a selection. I want this gradient to show up over my base layer, but beneath my midtone layer. So when I create a new layer, I want to make sure that new layer is between the midtone and the base layers. And if you made one and it wasn't there, you can actually grab it and relocate it in the order of your layers. I'm going to name this one Gradient. Okay, so I have my color picked, I'm on the right layer, and I have my selection made. So now all I need is my Gradient tool. Make sure my gradient is set up correctly, and then I'm just going to click and drag a line up, and that will create the dark down on the bottom and the light up on the top. And I can see any of these layers better at any time by just clicking the eyeball and hiding some of this stuff above it so I can see what that looks like. And then I'm going to deselect. The last couple of things I'm going to do before this button is final is I think this midtone is maybe a little too strong. I can affect the opacity of a layer by coming up to opacity in the layer panel and simply scrubbing that down just a little so it's not quite so strong. When making a button or any graphic for the web, you wouldn't want to include a whole bunch of white around the graphic, because when you uploaded it, it would show up like this with this white exactly around it. So we can hide that background layer by clicking the little eyeball tool, and then we can come up to Edit. I wasn't going to do this at first, but now I kind of want to. And go to, let's see, Image menu and choose Trim, and choose Transparent Pixels and click OK. Now it's sized exactly down to the size of the button that we made, And we can save a working file as a Photoshop file, and then when you would upload it to online, you could use either a JPEG or a PNG, are two of the basic files that get used. So that's the first introduction you've got to selection tools.